Thank you very much for some attention today, and we are here to discuss craft chocolate, how it can help your well-being, but also how eating great chocolate can also help the planet. So the first thing, though, is just to talk a little bit about chocolate. So we eat a lot of chocolate. 25% of Brits eat chocolate every day, and over 70% of us eat it at least once a week. So given that, I'm sure it will be no surprise to you at all that when you look at the statistics, we spend a lot of money on chocolate. We actually spend more money on chocolate in the UK than we do on published books or on recorded music. It's just staggering. But it's one of those fascinating products where we all know what a book looks like. We also know who writes books. We all know what recorded music is. But chocolate's a bit different. We don't really know that much about it. So what we're going to try and do, just very briefly, is just give you a little bit of information just so you can think a bit more about chocolate as you're enjoying it. So chocolate grows on trees. It literally is, it's what people say. Money grows on trees, chocolate grows on trees. In fact, the Aztecs used to use cocoa beans as a source of currency, but it grows in a fairly extraordinary way on the tree, because what it does is it shoots out the trunk of the tree. It's not like sort of a banana, or it's not like a wine which sort of grows on vines. It actually comes straight out the trunk of a tree. And then, just to add to the comedy, it's multiple colors. It's loads and loads of different colors. So it's green, it's yellow, it's red, it's purple, etc. And then you don't sort of like expect what you're going to get when you open a cocoa pod, but when you open a cocoa pod, it's got this amazing white pulp, which is beautifully sweet and delicious if you ever get a chance to suck it. And then inside that pulp are a series of seeds, which are incredibly bitter and astringent. And so the miracle is actually, how does this become chocolate? But before we get there, one other important attribute about chocolate is where it grows. So it grows in this extraordinary belt just around the equator. So 0 to 20 degrees north, and south as well. It comes from South America, and what you may or may not know about its history is that it goes back as far probably as wine, not as far as beer. I give you beer has a longer history, but chocolate has an amazing history. We can date it back to at least 3,000 or 4,000 BC. It's always been drunk. That's the other thing, is that we all now are used to eating chocolate, but actually chocolate has always been drunk. So the Aztecs did all sorts of wacky things with it, but it was very, very important for religious purposes for them. And ironically, when it first comes to Europe, it's also incredibly important because of religion. And the reason why it's important because of religion is because of this guy in the middle, who's Gregory the 13th. And he's one of those guys who basically says it's okay to have chocolate when you're fasting. So back in medieval, Renaissance, Reformation Europe, you had about 100 days of the year when you were not supposed to eat various foods. And so people would go hungry. And the aristocrats discovered that if they had a little bit of sugar to the drinking chocolate that they were getting from South America, it was extraordinary. It was just beautifully filling. However, there is a problem with drinking chocolate. And this problem is summarized by anybody who has a beard and has ever tried drinking chocolate will know, which is that chocolate does not dissolve well in water or milk. It doesn't stay stable in that. So if you've got a beard and you drink some chocolate, one of the disasters is that it will get stuck in your beard and congeal. And in particular, the Dutch in the 18th and 19th centuries got really upset and worried about this. And they got so worried about it that they invented something called a cocoa press. And the world was much happier. People could drink chocolate and not get it stuck in their beards. It wouldn't congeal when it got too cold. And then something extraordinary happened about 20 years after the Van Houtens discovered the cocoa press. Some guys in the UK, the Fries, discover that if you basically add back some of this cocoa butter that you're pressing out and you put it with the substance which you're making the cocoa drinks out of, you can actually create a stable substance. And this creates the first ever chocolate bar. Now, these chocolate bars are very, very, very different to the chocolate we're going to have today. If you ever get a chance to try something like Taza, that's a great example of what we call a stone ground bar. But it's radically different to the chocolate bars that we're all used to having today. And the reason why we're used to different chocolates is because of the Swiss. Now, the Swiss do three extraordinary things for chocolate. The first thing is that a guy called Rodolphe Lindt once leaves his grinder on overnight. This is the apocryphal story, and comes back to discover this amazing, smooth, milky, creamy substance, which becomes the modern chocolate bar. It's very, very different to this sort of stone ground chocolate. And then in parallel to this, there are two other people, Daniel Peter and a bloke we all know much better because of Nestle called Henri Nestle, who work out somehow that you can add milk powder to the chocolate making process and create what we call the first bliss point food. So milk chocolate starts to come through this. And this is what really catapults chocolate to become a mass product. Because if you go back to the 1850s, or even a bit before then, basically we drink far more coffee and we drink far more tea than we do drink chocolate. But once we learn how to make it into a bar, and once we learn how to make it into a smooth bar, and once we learn how to make it into a milk bar, chocolate just takes off. And this is the start of chocolate just being absolutely huge in everybody's lives. Now, this is wonderful in many, many ways, but if you think about all the varieties of chocolate that you can get, it's just like wine. So there are loads and loads and loads of different cacao varietals. So we're just showing you a picture here of a bunch of different cacao varietals just from one country, Nicaragua, all crafted by an extraordinary man, a Great Dane, as we like to call him in chocolate, called Mikkel Frisholm, who is in Copenhagen. And he basically turns these, just as different winemakers will turn different grapes into different wines. So Cabernet Franc will be different from Merlots, etc. You can do the same with chocolate. And this is absolutely wonderful. And it's just amazing because chocolate has more flavor in it than anything else. So I'm hoping that I'm getting your appetites and your taste buds all sort of whetted now, because very soon we're going to learn about how to taste chocolate too. Now, the thing which brings out flavor, though, is not just those bitter seeds inside all the different pods. What it actually is, it's the way in which those seeds react with a chemical process and yeast and bacteria in the air under something which is called fermentation. So all great products, whether it be wine or whether it be bread or whether it be coffee, they all involve fermentation. Chocolate's no different. But the extraordinary thing about chocolate is when it ferments, is it depends on how long you ferment it for, what the yeast and the bacteria are around there, and you get incredibly different flavors from different fermentations, and they're really well worth trying. And then after you've fermented the beans, which takes 3, 5, 7 days or so, you then have to dry it. And now drying can also make a huge difference to chocolate. In most countries in the world where you grow cacao, remember it's that belt, 0 to 20 degrees north and south of the equator, you've got sunlight. So here you can see some Madagascan ladies basically drying their cacao in the sun. But there are other countries in the world, like, for example, Papua New Guinea or Indonesia or Samoa, where it rains so much that you can't rely on that. So you have to have fires near where you're drying the beans to try and dry them out. And if you're a fan, for example, of Lapsang Souchong tea or of Islay whiskey, try chocolates from those regions because they really do have a very different, almost like a smoky flavor, which is extraordinary. Okay. Now, just to show you what we mean here, when we do virtual tastings, what we actually get you to do is to try 2 different chocolates. So these are, for example, 2 of those different chocolates. One is the Pura Porcelana, the pink one from Peru. And then the other is the wonderful one with the gorilla on it, which is from the Virunga National Park in the DRC, in the Congo, near Uganda. And these are made by the same extraordinary company, Original Beans. They're made with a very, very similar factory process. But what you can really taste when you try these 2 different bars is the different flavors and the different tastes that you get from different beans and different fermentations. And what we're showing you side to side is when people come to the virtual tastings, one of the things we get you to do is we try and get you to articulate what it actually is that you're tasting. Then you can actually appreciate how different it is. And that's going to come on to some of the hints that we're going to give you in a sec. And then the other stage, which is extraordinary with chocolate, is every different chocolate maker has a different style. So they're going to roast differently, they're going to grind and conch differently. They may even temper in a slightly different way. And this also impacts the flavor. Okay, now I really hope that we've got you wetted so that you're ready to try some chocolate. Because what we'd next like to get you to do is to learn about tasting chocolate like a pro. So here's the first bit. The first stage, which we strongly recommend, is just relax, calm down. Switch off those mobile phones. And above all, make sure that you've always got a couple of different bars on the go at any one time. Always have a few different chocolates whenever you're tasting. And I'll explain this to you in a little bit more. But be quiet, turn off the phone and get going. Then always have a glass of water and ideally either a glass of wine and or some tea or some coffee if that's your vice. Really helps actually just to have some water so that you can, as you're trying the different chocolates, you can wash them through. Chocolate's an amazingly social activity. So sit down with a friend, sit down with your partner, sit down with your kids, and we'll come on to more of the great benefits to it with kids, and just sit back and enjoy. One other piece of advice, Chocolate, dogs don't mix, not good. So no dogs near the chocolate, because otherwise they're not going to love it, and you're definitely not going to love the reaction to that at all, because it's going to be a lot of messiness which you're going to have to clean up. Okay, just as you all know, when you have a glass, and pretend this is wine, when you swill it round, you sniff it, that's absolutely right for what you need to be doing with wine. Now, chocolate has similar processes. So the first thing you want to do is you want to open up the chocolate and just see what's happening inside it. Look at it and see, is it shiny? Then break it and listen to this amazing snap. You should get a really good snap. Again, I'm going to do it. That snap means it's been properly tempered. It's not a badly tempered bar. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Then sniff it a bit, melt it. Let it melt in your hands. You really want this to happen. And then place it in your mouth and let it melt. Try not to chew it. And as it melts, really try not to chew it. As it melts, breathe in and out. And only when it's fully melted, which is going to take about 10 or 15 seconds, you can start chewing it. Now, that's the standard way of eating chocolate. Strongly recommended, always do that. But there are some fun games that you can play too. Let's move on to those. The first game is actually what we'd call how to tell flavor apart from taste. And this involves trying chocolate by actually holding your nose. And I'm going to explain to you why in just a sec, but wait for it. The second one is try eating a piece of chocolate super fast, scoffing it, and then savoring it and see what happens. And then the third is a little bit different, which is think about how you describe chocolate to a friend, because it'll really help you appreciate and understand more, and maybe even remember what you enjoy and find more bars that you will enjoy. Okay, first lesson. Bear with me, it's a little bit strange. Basically, if you put a piece of chocolate in your mouth and you suck it, you won't get any flavor. I'll explain to you what I mean by flavor in a sec, but you will get some taste. So taste is a series of receptors which are on your tongue and in your mouth and in your throat, actually all the way down to your gut. And it tells you what's sweet, what's sour, what's salty, what's bitter, also umami, also metallic. But just hold it until the chocolate's melted. Okay? Then what you want to do is release your nose. And ideally you've got a friend there with you, because what you should see is suddenly them going, wow, this is extraordinary. Because what should be happening is you're suddenly going to discover this amazing power of chocolate because of great cocoa butter to melt literally in your mouth and bring out flavor. So we all get taste and flavor a bit confused. Taste is something which you have receptors in your mouth, on your tongue to detect. Flavor is really to do with your sense of smell. It's your olfactory center. And you smell, or you exercise your olfactory center in two very different ways. The first is through your nose, but the other way is what's called retronasal olfaction. So that's a fancy way of saying that when you have a piece of chocolate in your mouth, or actually any foodstuff or any wine or anything else like that, you actually let the volatiles, the aromas, the polyphenols, release those extraordinary flavors through another pathway which goes to your olfactory center, your sense of smell in your brain. And that is what gives you a sense of flavor. Now, chocolate is one of the few, in fact, probably the only substance which melts at just below human body temperature. So it's the most amazing way to detect the differences between taste and flavor. But that's not the only thing which is extraordinary about the way in which chocolate has flavor. Remember we said earlier on how chocolate, those different cocoa varietals, those different fermentations create all sorts of permutations. As much as red wine has got, as much as wine has got as a whole, you get all these different permutations. So the other thing which is really, really important when you try chocolate is to basically think about it almost as a wave that you go through. So we have this wave, it's on the website, you can download it, print it off. But what it's really trying to do is get you to think about the different stages as you try a piece of chocolate. So the first stage is what we call the texture and the taste. That you get very immediately. When you put a piece of chocolate in your mouth, you can immediately sort of tell, is it smooth, is it grainy, what's it like? You immediately get the taste. Is it sweet, is it bitter, is it salty, etc. And then as it melts, you start to sort of, as if you're surfing a wave, you sort of get what we sort of call the next set of tastes, but really you start to get all the flavor from the chocolate. So you get, is it bright, is it spicy, is it jammy, is it coffee, is it citrus, etc. And then after about another 10 or 15 seconds, you suddenly start to get what we sort of call the aftertaste. And it's this length of taste which really separates out amazing chocolate. And it's the thing you want to be really savoring and really, really enjoying. This is when you're going to get the balance. This is when you're going to get the length. It's when you're going to get complexity. Lots of chocolates actually develop completely different flavors. They can be bright and citrusy up front, and then they can be berry as they sort of emerge and you go through them. So it really is extraordinary. So for example, this chocolate starts by being very, in my mind, very, very, very sort of chocolatey to start with. And then you're going to get all these extraordinary sort of cherry-like notes as you go through it. And I know you're thinking, well, this isn't right. You can't really do that with chocolate. But I promise you, you can. That really is the amazing thing about the cocoa bean. When it's properly fermented, when it's properly dried, when it's properly ground, when it's properly roasted, when it's properly conched, it brings out these extraordinary flavors, which you will just love, sit back, relax, and enjoy. And here's just an example of what we mean. So again, this chocolate that I was basically showing you before, this is the mini bar, but there's also a big bar, which is what you can see on the screen. Pump Street, amazing chocolate company down in Orford, father and daughter team, Chris and Joanna, plus Rob, extraordinary people. The beans for this bar actually come from where Chris was born back in Jamaica. But what we get people to do when you come to a tasting is we get you, again, chomp it really fast. Really, really quickly. And you can see what people get when they scoff is they get all that you'd expect. They get a bit of taste, the bitterness. They may get a little bit of the texture, the waxiness, maybe a bit of the creaminess. But when they savor it, it brings out all these other extraordinary flavor profiles. And you know, just try this at home because you really will be able to do it. And it works very, very differently. The other thing when you try a bar, as I just sort of said, is, you know, all great chocolates will tell you not just where they're from, but the name of the farm where they're from. So they're brilliant as a geography lesson. You know, basically you can find the makers and they're everywhere from Brooklyn to Budapest, Warsaw to Woodstock, Saigon to San Francisco, or where the farmers are from, everywhere from sort of Pura to Papua New Guinea, or the Daintree in Australia to the Dominican Republic. But again, you always want to be sort of like trying to find this out because it actually will tell you what sort of styles of chocolate, i.e. where the makers are from, and what sort of beans, what sort of origins you like. Just as people have favorites of different beers or different teas or different coffees, you should also have this for chocolate, we think. Right. Okay. Other things that you should enjoy about chocolate. Why are some chocolates just so much more Moorish than others? Why is it that it's sort of relatively easy to savor some chocolates, but others it's a bit more difficult? So the classic case here is the milk chocolate. And we talked a bit about this when we were talking about Nestle and Daniel Peter and the great thing that the Swiss did for chocolate, which is they figured out how to put milk into chocolate. So one of the things we always do whenever we have a tasting is we end with a couple of milk chocolates. And we deliberately end with milk chocolates, not because they're just a treat, but because what we discover is that most people find that with milk chocolate, it's a bit like Pringles. And what I mean by that is once you pop, you can't stop. It's pretty easy to savor these sorts of chocolates. But once you get this sort of milk chocolate, it's much, much, much harder. This sort of, you know, delightful milk chocolate, it's much, 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 much harder to resist just trying it because it's just Moorish. It's just more what you want. The Swiss didn't realize what they were doing back in the 1860s, 1870s when they did this. It took us about another 100 years to figure it out. There's a bloke called Moscovitz. He came out with this extraordinary idea, which is rather charmingly called the bliss point. And what the bliss point is all about is that human beings, when you add sugar, salt, and fat, we're programmed to like sugar, we want a bit of it. Programmed to like fat, we want a bit of it. Programmed to like salt, when we want a bit of it. But actually, normally, we stop wanting too much sugar, too much fat. You can't eat loads of sugar. You can't eat loads of fat on their own. However, if you combine the three, what Moscovitz worked out, this is the genius of the bliss point, is that human beings just can't stop eating. And that's why we sort of get gamed a bit with milk chocolate. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have your guilty pleasures. You definitely should. Chocolate in the bath, absolutely awesome. And I'm not saying don't eat milk chocolate. You definitely should. It's absolutely brilliant to be savored. I'm just saying be aware of the fact that what's happening with milk chocolate is that sugar and the fat from the milk, and sometimes even great milk chocolates like these will actually have a little bit of salt added to them. You're being played a little bit because actually you're being encouraged to eat more and more of it. So just as, you know, when you have those Pringles or when you have those Doritos, I know they've got the crunch, but actually what's happening here is that you are being slightly gamed, which is absolutely great and there's no problem with it. The other thing which we should talk about though in chocolate's case is that one of the other brilliant features of chocolate is that it has an extraordinary ability to carry other flavors. So if you take something like Cadbury's chocolate orange, which is one of the, you know, greatest long-standing brands in the chocolate world, you know, just think about it. Goes back to the 1930s. Actually, originally, Terry's tried to launch chocolate apple, didn't work too well. Then a chocolate lemon works a bit better, but with chocolate orange, they really got to it. What you're really getting here is the flavor from the orange, and that's awesome, and that's absolutely brilliant. And what mass chocolate makers have worked out how to do is to basically create extraordinarily consistent profiles of chocolate, generally through additives, and also how to work out the low price. Because you're not trying to get all these amazing varieties, which is what you're getting when you try great craft chocolate. What you're getting much more of is the fact that chocolate is an extraordinary vector for different flavors. Now, there is a sort of, an argument, we feel, that craft chocolate is just phenomenally better for you because it tastes better. We'd also like to argue, and we'll go into this in a sec, that it's much, much better for the farmers and the planet. And we'd also like to suggest that it's better for you because of the ingredients and because of the way in which it encourages you to savor. So let's just run through these a little bit more. So again, back to this point about chocolate being, used as almost just an ingredient like palm oil or like sugar or anything else. The problem is that there's a huge imbalance in chocolate, which if you come to one of our tastings, we can talk more about. But basically there's a handful, maybe a dozen or so really big chocolate companies who control almost all the chocolate grown in West Africa, which itself is 70% of the world's chocolate. But on the other hand, the farmers have very little power. There are very, very few. Farmers in cacao basically normally have less than 10 and normally only 1 or 2 hectares. And this is a real problem. And you combine this with the fact that that chocolate is just treated as a commodity, it's just bought and sold on that you've got the recipe for an environmental real challenge, because you've got basically big people, small farmers, and it's just a bit of a challenge. So one of the real tragedies with where chocolate's grown at the moment is there's been huge deforestation. So if you basically just take something like Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana, the similar figures there, basically if you look at those, they have massive problems with deforestation. So they were at one point, back 100 years ago, they were almost 90% plus virgin rainforest. By the 1990s, they're down to below 30%. By 2000, they're down to below 12, 15%. 3 or 4 years ago, they're down to 4 or 5%. And this is a real challenge for these countries because basically the farmers just don't know what to do. They don't make a huge amount of money. They make less than $1 a day, most of these poor cocoa farmers. They desperately need to grow more for their children. And so the problem is that they're cutting down the rainforest illegally. And the big chocolate companies, well, they've got to try and basically, serve their shareholders. So what they've got to try and do is basically get it for the lowest possible price. Now, they are trying. There are lots of initiatives. There's lots of stuff which is happening. But it's a really serious problem. And it's made even more serious by one of the things which people don't realize about chocolate, which is actually how much water you need. Now, with great craft chocolate, you actually need the rainforest canopy, which is where the chocolate grows, to basically cross-pollinate all those cocoa trees and for the bugs to go across. But in mass-produced chocolate, you're generally planting it and you can destroy the rainforest in doing it. Now, this is a real problem. When you take a bath at home, you're basically going to use 60 to 80 liters of water. When you eat a bar of chocolate, it will require anywhere between 1.5 to 2,000 liters of water. And this is fine if you're recycling all the water through the rainforest. But if you've destroyed the rainforest, it's a real tragedy. And so one of the big concerns for West Africa, for Ghana and the Côte d'Ivoire is not only are they going to be hit by global warming, which is going to cause them problems, but they're not going to have enough water to grow chocolate fairly soon, which is really serious because this is their main life. But it's the crop which basically supplies so much of the income for those countries. Okay. How do you tell different chocolates apart? I now hear you asking, because you don't want to be eating the stuff, which isn't good for you, which isn't good for you. So we basically, when we do our tastings, we are very clear. We basically explain to people, look, roast chicken. We all know what roast chicken is. Most of us are pretty good at actually being able to cook roast chicken. You go down to the supermarket, you buy a nice chicken. Mum or dad or whoever's the great cook in the house will basically put some nice herbs on it, season it, put it in the oven, bring it out. But sometimes we're too rushed. We don't have enough time, the kids just got back, you need to feed them or something like that. So we have chicken nuggets. Now, we all get the fact that they're slightly different products. You may not know everything about chicken nuggets. You may not know the fact that basically the way in which it's made is you take any bit of the chicken, you turn it into a powder, you dehydrate it, and then you add lots of flavorings, lots of additives, generally lots of things like sort of palm oils, emulsifiers, fats, and other stuff. Fry it, put it back, put it in a bag or put it in a box, stick it in the freezer, stick it in the fridge, and then when you're ready, you just sort of stick it in the oven and you just cook it again. Now, interestingly, chocolate can be made in 2 different ways, and then you can sort of compare them to basically you go out and you season the chicken yourself and you cook it in the oven, or do you make it basically by buying somebody else's work and then sticking it in the microwave? And this is actually quite important in chocolate, but it's actually very difficult for most people to tell those apart. So if we basically give you 6 different chocolates, and we do this in all of our virtual tastings, and we ask you to tell them apart, most people sort of, I'm not really sure. But there is actually a really, really easy way which we give you, which again, we're going to be basically giving you for today, which is actually, don't just look at the front of the chocolate, look at the back. So look at what the ingredients are. And what we've got on the screen here is just the ingredients from a well-known purple product in the UK, the US and Australia, and here's another one which is a well-known red product, which you'll all probably guess is what it is. But then if I go back to my Pump Street example and I turn it over, and you look at what the ingredients there are, they're completely different. They're really simple. And really, it's what your grandmother would advise you. Less is more. Basically, what you want to see in a chocolate bar is cocoa butter or cocoa beans, which is cocoa butter and cocoa mass put together, a little bit of sugar, nothing more than a bit of sugar, and then if it's a milk chocolate, a bit of milk. If it's got more than that, start to get a bit worried. The other things you want to look for, and they're really important, is you really, really want to know where the beans come from. And I don't just mean the origin or the country. You don't just buy, when you buy a wine, you don't just buy a European wine, you try and buy a wine from, some chateau or some, specific estate. And the same thing is true of chocolate. Next bit is try and figure out where it's made. One of the weird things about chocolate is it's really, really, really hard to figure out where it's made. Okay, so let's all add all this stuff up together and let's describe some other problems. One of the biggest problems with chocolate is we're completely spoiled for choice. It's just wonderful. Well, is it wonderful? Similarly with wine. Now, with wine, actually, we understand it a bit better. So what happens with wine is that most people, despite all the efforts by all these great marketeers to produce lovely labels, is they don't really get the labels. And it's pretty much the same with chocolate too. So what people do is they just say, what's on offer? What am I going to get, what am I going to get 2 for 4 or whatever it is, And in wine's case, it's basically what's on offer this week. What price is it? And then what color is it? And then have I heard of it? And then it's rinse and repeat. And it means that people can save a lot of time when they do this. In a convenience store, it's down to about 10 or 15 seconds. In a supermarket, it's about 40, 45 seconds. And in a chocolate, we don't actually have the exact numbers, but we think it's the same thing. Put it in context, 25, 30% of people, when they go to a supermarket, will end up taking chocolate out with them. But the number of people who actually have a specific chocolate written on their shopping list is incredibly few. It's just an impulse purchase, and it's just based on what's on offer because you don't really know how else to find what you should be after. So even looking at the label, you've got to do that, but you've got to think about some other ways to do it. So we think there is a much, much more fun model to follow, which is what we call the music model. So if you think about it, the music industry has had the most amazing tool for discovery that anyone has ever possessed: radio. Radio is just extraordinary. DJs are brilliant at introducing us to different musics, different bands. And in fact, even presidents of the United States, like Obama, they produce wonderful playlists to discover great new music. And it's just awesome how they do it and what they do with it. So for chocolate, what we've decided to try and do is every month, we basically send you 4 different bars of chocolate in a nice box like this. We never repeat a bar. You can choose if you want milk, if you want dark, or anything else like that. And that's what we try and do. The other thing that we try and do is we basically try and help you find your chocolate match. So let me give you an example of this, and we'll try and run through this in a second too. But finally, if you want to dive into this a little bit more, please, please, please come and join one of our virtual chocolate tastings. They're awesome fun. You can do them at home. You can do them as pairs, you can do them as individuals, you can do them with the whole family. You've got different size sets and everything else like that. The tasting, the pairing, just as you're watching this video, all that sort of stuff, you don't have to pay to come to them or anything like that. We do charge you a little bit for the kits, but they're great value. But please, 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 going forward, just savor the chocolate. Use it as an opportunity just to sit back and just think, it's a miracle, literally, that this extraordinary fruit, which grows out the trunk of a tree, which produces all these amazing flavors, can just produce such an amazing mouthfeel and such an amazing sensation. Thank you very much for your time.